May 8, 1945. Flensburg, northern Germany. The smell of diesel exhaust mingles with Baltic salt air as a convoy of British lorries rumbles through streets still cluttered with the debris of surrender. In the back of the lead transport, General Major Kurt von Schleicher sits ramrod straight, despite his hands being unbound, despite the absence of formal restraints. Around him, 11 other Wehrmacht generals maintain the posture of men who have not yet accepted that they have lost. They do not speak. The silence is not shame, not yet, but the cultivated discipline of the Prussian officer class, men trained since childhood to view defeat as a temporary administrative error rather than a fundamental collapse of worldview. Through the canvas flaps, von Schleicher catches glimpses of British soldiers directing traffic, organizing displaced persons, distributing ration packets with the casual efficiency of men who have done this before. He permits himself a thin smile. The British, he thinks, have always been excellent at administration. It is a shame they never learned to fight properly. This conviction that British military success came from luck and American materiel rather than genuine martial competence was not unique to von Schleicher. It ran like a theological certainty through the Wehrmacht's senior leadership, a belief system constructed from cherry-picked evidence and reinforced by years of stunning victories that seemed to confirm German tactical superiority. Had they not shattered French defenses in weeks when the Great War had ground on for years? Had they not outmaneuvered British forces at Dunkirk, at Tobruk, at half a dozen other engagements where German combined arms doctrine demonstrated what proper military thinking could achieve? The British endured, yes, but endurance was not the same as excellence. They absorbed punishment and called it strategy. They retreated and called it tactical flexibility. They survived through geographic fortune, that infuriating channel, and through their prostitution to American industrial might. The generals told each other this in the officers' clubs, in the planning rooms, in the careful conversations that acknowledged setbacks while maintaining faith in ultimate German superiority. Even now, riding toward captivity, von Schleicher and his peers constructed mental frameworks that preserved their dignity. They had lost to numbers, not to skill. They had been overwhelmed by materiel, not outthought by strategy. The British had not beaten them. They had simply outlasted them through the accident of geography and the prostitution of accepting American help. A proper army, a German army, would never have required such crutches. The convoy turns inland, away from the coast, toward the sprawling facility that British forces have designated as Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center. The name means nothing to the generals. They expect the usual: basic questioning, verification of identity, perhaps some crude attempts at intelligence gathering that their training has prepared them to deflect. They expect Spartan conditions. Victors rarely lavish comfort on the defeated, but nothing that will fundamentally challenge their understanding of what they have experienced. They are wrong on every count. The gates of the camp swing open. What von Schleicher sees first is organization, not the hurried improvisation of a newly established facility, but the settled efficiency of an institution that has been operating with refined purpose. Guard towers at proper intervals, administrative buildings with fresh paint, barracks arranged in geometric precision. But it is what he sees next that begins the first crack in his certainty. Vegetable gardens, tended by prisoners, yielding actual produce. A medical building with a Red Cross that appears to be staffed and functional. British soldiers walking without urgency, without the tension of men guarding dangerous enemies, as if the generals being processed are merely tedious administrative matters rather than captured warriors. They are led to a processing center where British clerks, not officers, clerks, take their information with the bored competence of bank tellers: name, rank, service number, next of kin. The questions are perfunctory. No one asks about troop movements or defensive positions or strategic planning. The war is over, and the British seem singularly uninterested in extracting secrets that no longer matter. This itself is unsettling. Von Schleicher had prepared speeches in his mind, careful constructions that would give nothing of value while maintaining his dignity. No one asks him to deliver them. The barracks, when they arrive, represent the second crack. Each general receives a private room, small but private, a bed with an actual mattress, sheets that appear clean, a wool blanket, a small desk, a chair, a shelf, a window with glass that is not broken. The room is perhaps 3 meters by 4 meters, hardly luxurious, but it contains something von Schleicher had not anticipated, evidence of intentional human dignity. This is not a punishment cell. This is not designed to break men through deprivation. This is simply adequate, and adequacy from one's captors is more psychologically disorienting than deliberate cruelty would be. Dinner arrives at 1800 hours, delivered on metal trays by British enlisted men who show neither deference nor hostility. The food arrests all conversation in the mess hall where the generals have gathered. Boiled potatoes, actual potatoes, not ersatz or stretched with sawdust. Tinned meat that proves upon tasting to be real beef. Bread made from wheat flour. Weak tea, but real tea. Margarine. Vegetables that might be from tins but are recognizably vegetables. The portions are not generous, this is not abundance, but they are sufficient and they are real. Generalleutnant Hans Kruger stares at his tray as if it contains a theological paradox. For the past 6 months, Kruger's troops had subsisted on increasingly desperate rations as supply lines collapsed. By April, some units were down to hardtack and whatever they could forage. Officers fared better than enlisted men, but only marginally. Kruger himself had eaten horse meat for 3 consecutive weeks, and not from horses killed for food, but from horses that had died from exhaustion or shrapnel and been repurposed before they could rot. And now, in captivity, in defeat, he is being served a meal that surpasses what he provided his own soldiers in the field. The symbolism is not lost on any of them, but they do not discuss it that first night. Instead, they eat in silence, and the silence is no longer discipline, but confusion. The routine of the camp establishes itself over the following days. Morning roll call, perfunctory and brief, breakfast, porridge, bread, tea. The day stretches ahead with little structure. Prisoners are allowed to walk the grounds within designated areas. They can read. The camp library contains books in German, somehow procured, somehow catalogued. They can write letters, which are censored but actually sent. They can play chess with sets provided by their captors. The British do not seem interested in breaking them through isolation or hard labor. The British seem interested primarily in keeping them fed, housed, and administratively catalogued. Von Schleicher finds this more disturbing than brutality would be. He understands brutality. Brutality has logic. The victor punishes the defeated, establishes dominance, extracts revenge. This careful adequacy, this maintenance of basic human dignity for men who had, after all, spent years trying to kill British soldiers, this speaks to something he does not understand and therefore cannot dismiss. The third crack comes from the camp physician. Generalleutnant Otto Weidling has been experiencing chest pains, stress-related almost certainly, the accumulated weight of the final months of the war. He requests medical attention, expecting to be ignored or given aspirin and told to endure. Instead, he is examined by a British doctor who takes his pulse, listens to his heart, asks questions about his medical history, and prescribes actual medication. The doctor is professional, neither warm nor cold, treating Weidling exactly as he might treat a British officer with similar symptoms. When Weidling returns to the barracks, he describes the encounter to his peers. He listened, Weidling says, and the simplicity of the statement contains volumes. He actually listened. He made notes. He said, if the medication does not help, he will refer me to a specialist. The generals absorbed this information. They had been taught that the British were sentimental and soft, that their concern for individual welfare was a weakness, that German efficiency had transcended. But what if it was not weakness? What if it was simply different mathematics, the calculation that maintaining the health of prisoners was strategically sound, economically feasible, and morally correct? The German system had operated on different assumptions, that resources were scarce, that sentiment was luxury, that efficiency demanded hard choices about who deserved care and who could be written off. But the British had resources, and they chose to spend them on enemy generals who could offer nothing in return. The fourth crack, the one that begins to shatter the framework entirely, comes from a package. The Red Cross parcels arrive in June. Each prisoner receives a standardized box containing items that seem selected to demonstrate not just adequacy, but the bewildering abundance of the Allied logistics network. Chocolate bars, actual chocolate, not the ersatz cocoa products that had become standard in Germany. Tinned milk, coffee, real coffee, not the roasted grain substitutes. Cigarettes, soap, condensed soup, cheese. The quantities are not enormous. This is one parcel meant to supplement rations, not replace them. But the fact that such parcels exist, that they are produced in sufficient quantities to distribute to prisoners of war, that somewhere there is an organization with the resources to assemble and ship these items to defeated enemies, represents a vision of material reality that contradicts everything the generals believed about the British war effort.
Von Schleicher opens his parcel alone in his room. He removes each item slowly, examining the packaging. American cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, the package design crisp and colorful in a way that German packaging had not been colorful for years. Swiss chocolate with labels in multiple languages. The tin of condensed milk bears instructions in English and French. These are not military rations repurposed. These are civilian products, manufactured to civilian standards, abundant enough that they can be spared for prisoners. He calculates in his mind, how many millions of these parcels? How vast must the production be? How secure must the supply chains be? How thoroughly must the Allies have won that they can afford to feed their enemies with what appears to be casual surplus? That night, in the mess hall, the generals finally begin to speak openly about what they are experiencing. The conversation is careful, circuitous, each man testing the waters of acknowledgement. Kruger mentions that the British Guards rotate with a regularity that suggests robust staffing levels. Another general notes that the lorries bringing supplies appear new or at least well-maintained. Von Schleicher mentions the Red Cross parcels, and the room falls silent again. But this time the silence is different. This is the silence of men confronting evidence that their entire framework for understanding the war might have been constructed on false premises. "We were told," Kruger says finally, "that the British were on the verge of starvation, that their rationing was desperate, that the U-boats had brought them to the edge of collapse." He does not finish the thought. He does not need to. The food on their trays, the regular deliveries, the casual adequacy of everything in the camp. This is not the logistics network of a nation on the verge of collapse. The interrogations, when they finally come, are nothing like what the generals expected. British intelligence officers arrive, polite and professionally dressed, and conduct conversations rather than interrogations. They ask about German tactical doctrine, yes, but with the curiosity of students rather than the aggression of prosecutors. They take notes. They ask follow-up questions. They seem genuinely interested in understanding how the Wehrmacht made decisions, not in extracting confessions or assigning blame. The tone is strange, collegial almost, as if the officers are discussing matters of historical interest rather than recent events in which thousands died. Von Schleicher finds himself answering questions he had planned to deflect, not because he is coerced, but because the conversation is structured in a way that makes deflection seem petty. The British officer asking questions has clearly read von Schleicher's service record, knows the campaigns he participated in, asks informed questions that demonstrate actual understanding of military operations. The respect is implicit, not respect for the cause, but respect for professional competence. It is unsettling to be treated as a professional by one's enemy, to have one's expertise acknowledged even as one's ideology is implicitly rejected.
Weeks pass. The routine continues. The food continues to be adequate. The medical care continues. Letters arrive from family members, routed through international aid organizations with an efficiency that seems impossible given that the continent is in ruins. Von Schleicher receives a letter from his wife, still in Bavaria, describing occupation by American forces. She writes carefully, aware of censors, but certain details emerge. The Americans have distributed food to German civilians. They have established medical clinics. They are rebuilding infrastructure not to extract resources, but to restore function. His wife's tone is bewildered. She had expected punishment, starvation, revenge. She describes instead a kind of aggressive normalization, as if the Americans are determined to demonstrate that their system can not only defeat enemies, but rehabilitate them. The psychological impact of adequate captivity is more profound than the generals can articulate to each other. They had prepared for suffering. Suffering would have confirmed their worldview, that the world is harsh, that only the strong survive, that their defeat was merely a temporary setback in the eternal struggle. But this careful adequacy, this maintenance of human dignity, this speaks to a different philosophy entirely. It suggests that the British and Americans believe in something beyond mere survival, that they operate from assumptions about human value that are incompatible with the ideology the generals had served. In August, the camp receives newspapers, British newspapers, translated summaries of articles. The generals read about the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. They read about the Japanese surrender. They read about the scale of Allied production, the numbers of tanks, aircraft, ships produced during the war years. The figures seem impossible until they remembered the Red Cross parcels, the regular meals, the maintained equipment. The numbers are impossible only if you assume scarcity. If you assume abundance, the numbers become merely impressive. Von Schleicher reads an article about American production of Liberty ships, cargo vessels constructed with such standardization that they could be built in weeks. The article mentions that American shipyards produced ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. He remembers the U-boat campaign, the pride with which German Naval Command announced tonnage sunk, the conviction that the British supply lines would strangle. But if the Americans could simply build faster than ships could be destroyed, then the entire strategic calculation had been wrong. The war had not been about courage or tactical brilliance, or even about who could endure more suffering. The war had been about production capacity, about which system could mobilize resources more effectively, about which society could transform civilian economies into military output without collapsing. The generals had mocked British tactical caution, their incremental advances, their careful preparation. But what if that caution came not from timidity, but from abundance? If you have unlimited shells, you can afford to soften targets with artillery rather than spending lives in frontal assaults. If you have replacement vehicles, you can afford to wait for mechanical issues to be resolved rather than pushing broken equipment to failure. The German army had celebrated its aggressive tactics, its willingness to accept casualties for rapid gains, its philosophical commitment to the offensive. But what if that aggression had been born not from superior warrior spirit, but from scarcity? When you lack resources, you must be aggressive because you cannot afford prolonged campaigns. When you have abundance, you can be methodical. Christmas 1945 arrives. The camp mess hall serves a dinner that includes roasted chicken, potatoes, vegetables, and pudding. It is not luxurious by peacetime standards, but it exceeds what most of the generals have eaten in years. British chaplains offer religious services for those who wish to attend. The gesture is optional, not mandatory, and this optionality itself is significant. The British are not trying to convert their prisoners or break them ideologically. They are simply maintaining a standard of human decency that includes the option of religious observance. Von Schleicher attends the service, though he is not particularly religious. He sits in the back and listens to the chaplain speak about reconciliation and peace, and he finds himself thinking not about God, but about systems. The British system, the American system, had produced enough material abundance that they could afford to feed their enemies. The German system, even at its height, had operated on the edge of scarcity, had required conquest to sustain itself, had depended on extracting resources from occupied territories because the homeland could not produce enough. The entire ideology of Lebensraum, of living space, had been predicated on the assumption that resources were finite and must be seized. But what if resources were not finite? What if the constraint was not land but organization, not conquest but production efficiency? Not military domination, but economic systems that could mobilize civilian populations without coercion. The thought is treasonous, and he knows it, but he cannot unthink it. He had spent his career serving an ideology that promised strength through discipline, efficiency through hierarchy, power through will. And that ideology had led to total defeat by nations the German leadership had dismissed as decadent and weak. The British, with their parliamentary debates and their concern for individual rights, the Americans with their jazz music and their consumer culture and their shocking informality. These were the nations that had outproduced, outorganized, and ultimately outfought the Third Reich. Not through superior courage, the Wehrmacht had never lacked courage, but through systems that could transform free citizens into productive workers and productive workers into military might without requiring the totalitarian apparatus that Germany had constructed. In February 1946, von Schleicher is transferred to a different camp, this one designated for denazification processing. The British are beginning the long project of determining which German military leaders were war criminals and which were merely soldiers. The process is bureaucratic, methodical, exhausting. Von Schleicher answers hundreds of questions about his service, his knowledge of atrocities, his participation in various campaigns. The interrogators are looking for specific facts, specific orders, specific knowledge. They are not interested in philosophical guilt or abstract responsibility. They want evidence.
He is eventually cleared of war crimes, classified as a career officer who served in combat roles but did not participate in or have direct knowledge of systematic atrocities. The designation feels inadequate. He had served the regime, had enabled its conquests, had followed orders from a criminal government. But the British system, with its emphasis on individual accountability and specific evidence, does not have categories for the kind of diffuse moral responsibility he feels. He is released in 1947, repatriated to occupied Germany, given travel papers and a small sum of money, and sent back into a world that no longer resembles the one he knew. The Germany he returns to is divided, occupied, transformed. In the British and American zones, he finds the same pattern he experienced in the camp writ large: adequacy, organization, the methodical application of resources to rebuild what had been destroyed. The Marshall Plan is beginning, American aid flowing into Europe not to punish but to reconstruct. The logic is economic and strategic. Stable European economies serve American interests, but the effect is the same as the Red Cross parcels in the prison camp.
a demonstration that the Allied system has resources to spare, that abundance is not zero-sum, that former enemies could become partners, that the wealth of nations could be increased rather than merely redistributed through conquest. Von Schleifer takes a job as a clerk in a reconstruction office, a humiliating position for a former general, but he needs to eat, and he no longer has the certainty that made such humiliations unbearable. He files paperwork, processes requests for building materials, watches American and British administrators organize the rebuilding of German infrastructure with the same casual competence they brought to running the prison camp. They are not particularly imaginative, they do not have brilliant insights, they simply have systems that work, resources to deploy, and a philosophy that assumes problems can be solved through adequate application of organization and materiel. He lives another 30 years, long enough to see West Germany transform into an economic power, long enough to see the German economic miracle that rebuilds the nation into prosperity. He watches this reconstruction and understands that it was possible only because the Allies chose to invest in recovery rather than extraction, chose to rebuild rather than punish, chose to operate from assumptions about human dignity and economic development that were incompatible with the ideology he had served. The miracle was not German resilience, though Germans were resilient. The miracle was a system that believed prosperity was not zero-sum, that former enemies could become partners, that the wealth of nations could be increased rather than merely redistributed through conquest.
In his final years, living in a modest apartment in Stuttgart, von Schleicher occasionally gives interviews to historians studying the Wehrmacht. He is careful in what he says, aware that his generation is still controversial, still processing its complicity and catastrophe. But when pressed about what changed his understanding, he returns always to the same image, the Red Cross parcel in the prison camp, the chocolate bar and the condensed milk, and the casual abundance of a system that could afford to feed its enemies. "We thought," he says to one interviewer, "that their concern for individual dignity was weakness. We thought that our efficiency, our willingness to make hard choices, our discipline, we thought that made us strong. But strength that requires cruelty to sustain itself is not strength, it is just cruelty. And when it met a system that could be generous because it was abundant, our cruelty proved insufficient. Not because they were better warriors, but because they had built something we had not, a society that could mobilize free people to produce more than our slaves ever could." The interviewer asks if he regrets his service. Von Schleicher considers the question, recognizes the trap it contains. Regret is personal, but his service enabled horrors beyond the personal. He settles on a different truth. "I regret that we did not understand what we were fighting. We thought it was a war between nations. It was actually a war between systems, between philosophies about what humans are worth and what societies can achieve. And we fought for the wrong system. Not because we were cowards, we were not cowards, but because the system we fought for could only sustain itself through conquest and exploitation, and the system we fought against could sustain itself through production and consent. In the long run, there was only ever one possible outcome." He dies in 1976, 61 years old, a footnote in histories written by men who never knew the certainty he once possessed. But his journey, from the arrogant certainty of May 1945 to the bewildered understanding of his final years, maps the larger transformation of a generation that learned, through the mundane evidence of adequate meals and functional systems, that the war they thought they were fighting was not the war that actually occurred. They had expected to be defeated by better soldiers. Instead, they were defeated by better systems. They had expected cruelty from their captors. Instead, they received adequacy.
and adequacy, when delivered by those you had dismissed as weak, is more devastating to ideology than any torture could ever be. The prison camp at Flensburg closed in 1948, its purpose served, its prisoners processed and released or transferred. The barracks were eventually demolished, the grounds repurposed. Nothing remains of the physical structure, but the lesson it taught, that democracies at war can afford to be decent, that free societies can mobilize resources more effectively than authoritarian efficiency, that the concern for individual dignity is not weakness but a source of strength. That lesson outlasted the buildings, outlasted the men who learned it, and became part of the quiet evidence that the Second World War was not won by the side willing to die with greater fervor, but by the side capable of organizing abundance while maintaining humanity. The generals had mocked the British until the gates opened. After the gates opened, they learned to stop mocking and started, slowly, painfully, to understand.